Good afternoon and welcome to this week's Parasha Shiur on the Parasha of Shofetim, which is one of the last Parashah, one of the last sections towards the end of the book of Devarim, and has some fascinating material, particularly on matters relating to what today we would call Jewish public law. In other words, what are the laws pertaining to the state, to the government, and their application on the populace. And whereas the Parasha, just to briefly give a summary, starts talking at the beginning about the appointment of judges and the appointment of a king and whether that's indeed a mitzvah to have a monarch or not, it also runs through a number of other elements about how the state or any ruling organization or some kind of polity would refer to the people and would act towards the people. And we're going to focus at the end of the Parasha on a passage which is almost a kind of bookend to what happens at the beginning of the Parasha. The beginning of the Parasha talks about the appointments of judges. At the end of the Parasha talks about one of the most difficult things that judges have to do. So thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for being part of the Shiur this week and other weeks. And I hope you'll find some really fascinating and very relevant materials, even from some very very difficult cases, which we can also think about principles to apply to our lives today. So thanks to my colleagues David and Rebecca, who've set up this live stream and have also uploaded a source sheet for you, which can be downloaded from the link which is on the screen now. The source sheet is in Hebrew, but it's got line numbers on, so I'm going to read through the relevant parts and I will identify where we are at every line and translate the Hebrew as well. So hopefully, even if you're not so familiar with the Hebrew, you'll be able to follow as best as possible. If you want to use a chumash, such as here's the Art Scroll Stone Chumash, or since we've got things to show, the Torah Reading edition, a beautiful edition which I enjoyed studying from for many years and still do. We're going to be looking at the last 3 verses of the Parasha. So that's in the book of Devarim, Deuteronomy, chapter 21, verses 7, 8, and 9. And in the Art Scroll, you'll find it beginning at the foot of page 1042, and it's at lines 1 and 2 on the sheets that we have. Now, first, a little bit of background to this particular episode. The closing episode, which I referred to in the Parasha, is a very, very difficult one. The Torah describes a case where a corpse has been found, regrettably, equidistant between cities, and it's not clear how the corpse was murdered. We can't find out what the circumstances were. So the question arises, who takes responsibility? First of all, for, of course, looking after the burial needs of the corpse, but also in more general terms, who takes responsibility that for such a thing having happened, and what is going to be done about it? And the Torah tells us about a very unusual ceremony called the Eglah Arufah, where instead of a human being punished for it, a calf somehow is punished for it. Now, we're not going to focus on that particularly, but what we are going to focus on in these verses is the reaction to that particular ceremony. And if you look at line 2, please, on the sheet, which is verse 7, if you're looking in the Chumash, then we'll read what the declaration that is made by the elders of the city who have to take responsibility for what has happened, even though, of course, they're not personally culpable, but nonetheless, for the more general circumstance that such a thing could have happened, so to speak, on their watch. So the Torah says as follows, and let's read the verses really carefully and try and put ourselves in the shoes of the people who are speaking, the elders of that city, and think about what they're saying, to whom they might be speaking, and what the meanings of this are. So the Torah says, "Va'anu va'amaru," and they should answer and say. Perhaps someone has spoken to them, if they should answer, or perhaps va'anu also means, as Rashi, one of our great commentators, teaches us, they should say in a loud voice. Rashi says elsewhere. But they should answer and they should say, Yadeinu lo shafcha et ha'adam hazeh ve'einenu lo ra'u. We declare that our hands did not spill this blood, and we didn't, our eyes didn't see what happened. We didn't have any direct responsibility, even though we've taken responsibility somehow. And remember, this is stated after the ceremony with the calf, which is, so to speak, an atonement sacrifice of sorts for what has happened. And then in verse 8, line 3 on your sheets, Please, God, it's a request, speaking to God, please atone for your people Israel, who you have redeemed. Fascinating that people are being redeemed. Redeemed from what at this point? Redeemed from Egypt? Redeemed from something else? We don't know at this point. And do not please allow there to be innocent blood, in parentheses, shed amongst your people Israel, and somehow the responsibility for the blood, i.e. for the murder, is atoned for them. Now this is fascinating. The word kaper, of course, is familiar to us, perhaps most familiar through Yom Kippur. And we know that Yom Kippur is a day of atonement. Well, what does that mean? The great Rabbi Joseph B. Soloveitchik, one of the leading rabbinic scholars of the 20th century, for many years the head of studies in Yeshiva University in New York, in his book about teshuvah, about repentance, which is called On Repentance, and is featured in an upcoming US and Korean publication for the Yamim Noraim that I hope you'll get to see soon. Rabbi Soloveitchik understands that the kapara, the atonement of Yom Kippur, is that God will agree to wipe a slate clean, so to speak. But the other word which is used in the verse, which talks about this atonement of Yom Kippur, which gives an injunction of tahara, of purification. Rabbi Soloveitchik says, refers to the work we do on ourselves. He likens it in a sense to a stain on a shirt. If you might remember when you were a child, you would say you spilt something like tomato ketchup, or in my case, even worse, green tomato ketchup, on your shirt. And an adult says to you, oh no, look what you've done. And you say sorry. Oh, and now it might say it's okay. And that's good of them. That's atonement, let's say. But the problem is, there's still the stain on the shirt. So you need to clean the stain on the shirt. Rabbi Soloveitchik says you need to clean a stain on your soul, so to speak, that a sin creates. So over here, the elders are saying, God, please atone for us. But the second question, so to speak, is left hanging. What are we then going to do? Even if God has atoned for us, God has atoned, but the situation still happened. There's still the future to consider. What are we going to do? And then the Torah ends this particular parasha and says, now here, this is, to me at least, is a difficult verse, because it's not immediately clear to me who is speaking to who in this verse. It's almost as if Moshe, as instructed by God, is speaking to the people at this point, rather than quoting what the elders might be saying, the elders of the city might be saying. The atah is in the singular. You should somehow get rid of any innocent blood. Perhaps stop the shedding of innocent blood is a better translation. From amongst you. Now, ki could mean for, it can mean when, it can mean if, it can mean a number of things. Let's see here, it means because you will do what is upright in the eyes of God. Now, we've managed to translate this, but what does it actually mean? Let's summarize. We've had some elders who've needed to make a declaration after a difficult ceremony has taken place in some tragic circumstances. And having even taken responsibility, they've said, we didn't do this, but nonetheless, again, in parentheses, we've taken responsibilities. And therefore, God, please atone for your people and make sure they're not still considered guilty of whatever negligence or whatever other form potentially of liability led to this difficult situation taking place, an unidentified corpse not being welcomed previously, of course, when it was alive in a city or wherever else, and somehow it's just been left to die or be attacked. And then at the end, there's some kind of imperative again. You should somehow take away, get rid of the innocent blood. If you do, or because you do, what is upright in the eyes of God. Whom is speaking to who? What is going on over here? How did the two things go together? I want to examine what some of our great commentators say about this. And in doing so, I hope we'll be able to understand some very important principles about the book of Devarim as a whole, and which are very applicable to our daily lives. Before we get into them, just another quick summary. The book of Devarim itself, as I'm sure you're aware, is a book which has a number of speeches in it, from Moshe Rabbeinu as instructed by God, from Moses as instructed by God. And these are kind of valedictory speeches. Some of them focus on history lessons for a new generation, because this is the end of the 40th year in the desert. The people are soon to go into the lands of Israel under the leadership of Joshua. Other parts focus on what we might call moral lessons in our language today, how to act. Others focus on particular mitzvot, which one needs to do, commandments which one needs to fulfill, and mitzvot for things which one must avoid. Some of them relate particularly to the land of Israel, such as laws relating to the temple or of getting rid of idolatry from the land of Israel. Others relate to life much more generally. Possibly even an example is the passage which we are looking at. So these are a summary of ideas of the content of what is in the book of Devarim as a whole. And I think this summary is helpful for us for thinking about understanding what the commentators say about these verses. Now let's look first of all at Rashi, the great Rabbi Shlomo Yitzchaki, 1040 to 1105, an Ashkenazi commentator, lived in France, and the areas today we call France and Germany. And Rashi, of course, is not only often our first port of call, but will write in a way which tries to give us the meaning of the text, not necessarily the translation of the text per se. Let's see what he says, line 7. V'ata teva'er, and you should get rid of. Who is this referring to, and what does this mean? Magid she'im nimtza ha'horei, achar she'nitarfa ha'agala, harezeh yehareg. Now Rashi makes a very important point for us, that if the killer is found, the murderer is found, after the ceremony with the calf has taken place, has culpability been washed away? Despite what the elders have said, when they've said to God, please atone for the sin, the Rashi says, no. Even though, coming back to the ideas we expressed from Rabbi Soloveitchik, even though the ceremony has taken place, if the murderer is then apprehended, then culpability still exists, and a responsibility on the governing body at the time to put the laws of the Torah, the laws of Judaism, into practice still exists, and it still needs to take place. And this is what is upright in the eyes of God. A fascinating Rashi, because Rashi is telling us that on the one hand, there is an instruction here as to what to do, and there is a kind of sense of strengthening to say that this is the thing which is upright. This is the way Rashi understands the juxtaposition of these words in the verse, that by doing what the Torah tells you, that is acting in an upright way, obviously within all the parameters of how judicial matters should be conducted and in the correct way. But assuming the most difficult and most sharp case, if the full culpability for murder needs to be administered, then that's what needs to happen, and that is what is upright. Otherwise, and this is left hanging from Rashi, perhaps there is a moral problem in a society that gives a signal, at least, that it's prepared to tolerate such things going on. So bearing in mind what we said about a summary, or a summary of the book of Devarim, we see here that Rashi blends an idea of law, of what the responsibility is in terms of the halacha, but also with a moral lesson, we might call it, as to why this needs to take place. So Rashi, therefore, helps us understand, I think, the phraseology in the Torah, that even if the elders of a city, acting as judges, have done what they need to do, the society as a whole, each individual person as a whole, has a responsibility to make sure that the values of the judgment and the values of Judaism in a society are upheld. This is for all of us. We can't, so to speak, shirk a responsibility and say it's just for them being the judges, them being the law enforcement officers. If there's something which we can do to make a society better, then we must do that as well. A very powerful lesson, which I think comes out from Rashi over here, especially in this very difficult case. And even if something has been done, which in a sense makes us feel that we have recognized what has happened, we've tried to do the atonement, as Rabbi Soloveitchik would put it to us, the purification of the soul still needs to take place. The rebuilding of society, looking to the future, still needs to take place. And of course, this is a very, very important lesson to be considered in its own way and its own context for areas of modern life today. So that's the first explanation, which is of Rashi. Now, I want to look next at the explanations of Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, another of the great commentators in the 11th and 12th century, who traveled widely around the Jewish world. And let's see what the Rav Abraham Ibn Ezra, often called Ibn Ezra, says about this particular verse, at verse 9. So he says, this is at line 10, and you should wash away, get rid of the innocent blood, prevent it being innocent blood. Perusho onesh hadam hanaki, o ye hadam dam naki. He says the explanation is the punishment for there being innocent bloodshed, or there will be more innocent bloodshed. So for the Ibn Ezra, if you don't uphold the law and you don't have a sense of people understanding the importance of this, then building a little bit on what Rashi said, it might lead, God forbid, to more problems. And again, this is not simply the responsibility of law enforcement officers. This is the responsibility of everybody. Think, for instance, in your own way, in your own context, over the last few months, and the responsibilities in society that every individual have had to display, not just say, oh, it's up to the police, or it's up to a law enforcement agency, or I'm not taking responsibility. We've all had to take responsibility and think about what the ramifications of our actions are in a way which is perhaps very difficult and uncomfortable and different from the ways that at least some people have had to think of before. So that's the first explanation of the Ibn Ezra. Towards the end of line 10, he provides a second explanation. And that's 5 words from the end of the line, where he says, V'yei shomerim, and there are others, other scholars who suggest, Ata chayav leva'er shfichut damim. You are obligated to get rid of murder in any way. One of the lessons of this very sorry and sad tale is that it should never be allowed to be repeated. Not just a case of there was some kind of culpability of murder, and people understood what had happened, but particularly a case where as we've seen over here, no one knew what happened. No one could figure out what happened. So for the Ibn Ezra, part of the obligation on everybody is to try and create a society where such things like murder would never, ever happen. We can almost add that we would have laws which are in place to teach us about what would happen, but should never need to be applied. As so many laws we have teach us in this way, learn the lessons of the laws, and we hope they never have to be applied. And of course, in Jewish jurisprudence, particularly Talmudic jurisprudence, we learn a lot about this, especially with relationship to some of the more difficult human situations and the extreme punishments available to courts, which in practice would never or almost never take place. But they are there to help teach us and understand about the kind of society we should build and the responsibilities we have, and of course what happens if certain really important things go wrong. So that's the second explanation of the Ibn Ezra. His third explanation is 3 words along in line 11. And he says as follows, V'hanachon be'enai, but the most accurate explanation, in my view, is as follows. Hu asher hizkarti, ki lo yishafech adam naki ba'artzecha, im ta'aseh hayashar b'nei Hashem. That if you do ultimately what is upright in the eyes of God, then there will not be any innocent blood shed in your land. Now, this is a very subtle explanation, because, of course, the question which it begs is, how do I work out what is upright to do in the eyes of God? I'm just a human being. How do I know? If God hasn't spelt it out to me, let's assume for a moment he hasn't, how do I know what to do? For the Ibn Ezra seems to suggest that if there is a way of doing things in an upright way before God, we today might call it a moral way or the correct way of doing things, not just getting a job done, but doing it in the right way, not just doing a mitzvah, but doing it in the right way, and thinking about the positive ramifications we can make from it. If you do that, you will create a society where these awful things will not happen. So the imperative to all of the people is very clear. He says that if you do what is upright in the eyes of God, then there won't even be any innocent bloodshed. And he notes this based on a rabbinic teaching that says that the reward of a mitzvah is a mitzvah, but conversely, the reward of an aveirah is an aveirah. The reward of a positive act done is another positive act, and vice versa. The reward of a negative act or a forbidden act done is another forbidden act. In other words, we learn this in the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, which we're saying on Shabbat afternoons at the moment. If you do one thing, a good deed, let's say, and let's keep in mind Rabbi Soloveitchik's explanations, that good deed will somehow mold your soul and your character to do another good deed. And it'll become in some way, I suppose, harder to do bad things, and vice versa. And if unfortunately it's vice versa and one bad thing leads to another, then it's going to be harder, even though the obligation is still there, to pull back and get onto the correct path. So the Ibn Ezra, doing what is yashar, doing what is right, or upright, I should say, in the eyes of God, is recognizing the implication of our actions. And the more good we do, the more good we will do afterwards. We will continue to be able to do. So from this very sad and sorry tale, the Ibn Ezra learns not just an imperative on the law enforcement agencies, but an imperative on everybody, and how everybody's actions have an impact, even if it's not immediate, on the tone and the texture of broader society. Moving forward in history, even though we've looked at medieval commentators so far, I just want to briefly look at one of my favorite commentators, the Netziv, Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, who was one of the heads of the yeshiva in Volozhin in the 19th century. Volozhin was, depending where you come from, was considered to be the Oxbridge of Lithuanian yeshivot. Although if you're from Lithuania, you might have said it was the Oxbridge of European yeshivot. And Rabbi Berlin gave very regular shiurim on the Parasha of the week, not just on topics of Talmud or of Jewish law. And he has some very, very fascinating comments every week, which I enjoy studying. And he says, I'll just summarize it just because I'm keeping an eye on the time. He says that if there are many people who are gathered together, and he builds here on the words of Ramban, one of the other great medieval commentators, then somehow when people come together and take responsibility, as they have to do in the ceremony relating to the calf, then this will inspire people to take steps with God's help to get rid of evil things amongst them. Think again in our times, when in times of difficulty, people have come together to make statements about what is right and what is wrong, and hopefully be inspired to carry those statements over into the actions which they then take. And therefore, says Rabbi Berlin, people will be inspired to do what is right, and if they have been properly inspired in such gatherings and they have seen leaders showing a correct example, then hopefully they will learn from those leaders as to knowing what to do is right in the eyes of God. I think a very beautiful and then practical idea which we can think of today. It doesn't need to be in an enormous demonstration. It can be even in a smaller setting, but it shows our sense of caring for each other, our sense of coming together and recognizing our mutual obligations. I think, though, there's still a bigger question which we need to deal with before we can conclude. And that is, in the broader sense, what is the meaning of any injunction to do what is upright, or as it's sometimes stated in the book of Devarim, good in the eyes of God? And in the footnote at the bottom of the page, there are a couple of other examples, not the only examples, but a couple of examples of how this phraseology is used in other places in the book of Devarim. Is it just kind of encouragement? Is it just a kind of general moral idea? What might it actually mean in practical terms? And I think when we look at this, it will help us to understand even better why our parasha ends with this particular phraseology, not just in relationship to the calf and to this terrible situation, but in general, as I mentioned, as a bookend to all the ideas of public law and of setting up a just society, which the parasha deals with. So we need to go back a little bit. If you look at line 19, we need to look at a similar language in a verse in the Parasha Ba'et Chanan, which is always read on the Shabbat after the fast of Tisha B'Av. And Moshe, in the beginning, towards the beginning of his very lengthy valedictory speech, this particular valedictory speech goes from around chapter 6 to the end of chapter 26. Certainly this is how I understood it from my teacher, Rabbi Menachem Liebtag, in his analysis of the book of Devarim, which very much influences the way that I learn the book. The Moshe Rabbeinu says as follows, line 19, "V'asita hayashar v'heitov b'nei Hashem." You shall do what is upright and good. We have a word added here, which is good, in the eyes of God. L'ma'an yitav lach, in order that things will be good for you. And you will come and inherit the good land. Remember, the audience here are the people at the end of the 40 years in the desert. They're about to go into the land. Moshe is prepping them to do so. You will inherit the good land, which God swore to your ancestors, of course, in parentheses, to give to you. So what is the tov v'yashar, the good and the upright, that Moshe is referring to here? So at line 21, Rashi gives us a fascinating explanation. Rashi says, very short comment, he says, Hayashar v'hatov, the upright and good, in this particular context, Zob shara lifnim mishurat hadin. This is compromise of going beyond the letter of the law. Rashi seems to be referring to a passage in the Talmud, in the tractate of the volume of Sanhedrin, which as its name suggests, Sanhedrin, talking about a rabbinic court, deals with many topics related to in our parasha. And on page 6 of that volume of the Talmud expresses a preference, particularly in cases, let's say, of commercial dispute, for people finding a compromise position rather than going to court, find an agreed compromise that suits them rather than going to court, even if this means that somehow you're not necessarily going to get the fullest result for one party or another. If the general sense is that they can both benefit, then a sense of compromise is better. And this is considered to be going beyond the letter of the law. Even though you're not required to compromise, according to the strict letter of the law, it's what you should do. It's the kind of person you should be, if at all possible, in the particular circumstances. Sometimes, of course, it's not, but other times it is. So Rashi here, fascinatingly, suggests to us, I think, that going beyond the letter of the law is something which has the force of a Torah injunction. It's not necessarily taught to us as a mitzvah or an obligation, but in terms of applying it where you can, it has force from the Torah. And at least considering it, that wherever you can, going beyond the letter of the law in a way which is going to make things better for everybody, particularly, say, in a case where you're not insisting on all of your rights to the great detriment of others. This kind of compromise obviously builds a happier, better society, we would hope. And this is going beyond the letter of the law. This is one way of understanding what Tov v'Yashar means. Even if I feel I don't have to do it, if it's the right thing to do, and if others will benefit, then that's what I must do. And that's part of the responsibility on each individual. We'll close with a very striking passage, which to me is one of the most, or for me, I should say, has been one of the most impactful pieces of rabbinic writing that I've studied. And this is the commentary of the Ramban, who I mentioned earlier, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, who lived from 1190 to 1274, a doctor, a scholar, a Kabbalist, wrote much on the Talmud as well as on his commentary on the Torah, and of course famous particularly for his winning role in the debate he had against an apostate Jew in Spain in 1263, which had to precipitate, unfortunately, him leaving Spain, even though he fulfilled his lifelong dream of going to Israel. But the reward for winning such debates in those days was you had to flee. And at least one fled, I suppose, with one's life rather than having lost it. But the Ramban says as follows, line 23. He says, "V'asita hayashar v'hatov b'nei Hashem, al derech hapshat yomar, tishmeru mitzvot Hashem, ve'edotav v'chokotav, v'tichavein ba'asiyatan la'asot hatov v'hashar b'einav bilvat." It seems that the straightforward meaning would be, you need to fulfill the various kinds of mitzvot which are commanded us, the various categories of commandments, and when you are doing so, your intention, and in some ways, I suppose, your motivation for what you want to achieve, should be to do what is good and upright in the eyes of God only, rather than in your eyes. So one shouldn't be trying to do a mitzvah to say, I'm somehow going to try and trick another person, I'm doing a mitzvah, but really it's for what I want to get out of it, rather than what I should be getting out of it according to the Torah. And he says in line 24, and in order that it'll be good for you, haftacha, this is a promise. It's not some kind of prediction. If you get it right, it's a promise that things will be good for you. If you do what is good in God's eyes, it will be good for you. Because God does good to those who do good and are upright towards Him in their heart. And the Ramban here notes that the comment which Rashi also provided for us, that a person should consider going beyond the letter of the law in the ways that we've just discussed. Let's jump down to line 28, just as we are close to finishing. The Ramban says, this is a very, very great thing. Because it's impossible for the Torah to mention all of the laws in every detail, all of the ways that a person should behave in every detail with his neighbors and others around him. I remember hearing a lecture once online from one of Gordon Brown's team when he was the Prime Minister and he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer as well, and how they debated whether one should give lots and lots of, that they should make lots and lots of laws for people so everything was very clear, or whether that was too much. It was better to have smaller categories of laws, or perhaps to have headings, so to speak, and people would then work it out themselves. Okay? If they knew the general direction of what the law wanted for them and what the objective was for how we build a better country ahead. So these lessons, of course, are considered by politicians in our time as well. The Ramban continues towards the end of line 28. It's impossible for the Torah to give us behavioral guidance for all of the ways we act with our neighbors and our friends, and in every element of business lives, and in international matters and matters of state as well. Aval, he says in the line 29, 3 words in, after many such things that have nonetheless been mentioned, such as don't spread poisonous tales about people, do not try and get revenge against people or bear grudges in ways which creates tremendous problems. Do not stand idly by when someone is in danger. Don't curse someone who doesn't know it. All of these laws, by the way, the Ramban takes from chapter 19 of the book of Vayikra, the Sidra of Kedoshim, which the Ramban is another crucial parasha in understanding the headlines of what the Torah wants from us. Learn those mitzvot we can infer from the Ramban, and you'll figure out what kind of person the Torah wants you to be. And he says at the beginning of line 31, and similar mitzvot to these. Torah is teaching us, says the Ramban, that a person should make sure to what is good and upright in everything they do, not just these things that have been listed. So he can become the kind of person that can compromise, can understand how to build a society together with others, not against others, and can go beyond the letter of the law so that everybody somehow feels a part and everybody is somehow included and has good relations with others. And line 32, he quotes here an example of a law in the Talmud where if you are selling land, you should offer it to your neighbor first in case it helps his life to be able to combine his land and your land rather than selling it to someone else first. And similarly, in another Talmudic reference, people will look at such a person and say, oh, this is a good person. They reflect good character traits. They do good things for society. This is what is tam, is yashar, upright, and we can add good as well. So I think a fascinating and important lesson from the Ramban, which helps explain the particular passage we've looked at as well. To summarize, we've looked at the very typical passage of Egla Arufa, where a corpse was found between cities, unidentified. No one knows what happened. No one knew the circumstances. Responsibility is taken by elders of one of the nearby cities, and a ceremony takes place involving, sadly, the sacrifice of the calf. And in a sense, there is some form of atonement, but the last 3 verses of the parasha are enigmatic. What do we still need to do? Who are they addressed to? We see in how Rashi tells us that even though the ceremony has taken place, there is still an obligation to pursue justice and to look after the society. We've seen how Rabbi Soloveitchik told us that even if atonement has taken place, sorry has been said, an apology has been accepted, there's still, so to speak, the stain on the soul which needs to be rubbed out. We've seen how Rav Avraham ibn Ezra tells us that ultimately, if you can understand the best ways of avoiding such a situation, through acting always in the right way, you will build a society which is upright so that such situations will never, ever happen again. And we've seen the words of Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Yehuda Berlin, the Netziv, who says that by people being impacted by the ceremony, they will be inspired and learn how to act in the correct way. And then finally, we've seen Rashi and the Ramban, more generally, in a more general moral sense, I suppose, saying that if we can learn how to compromise where possible, as best we can, and understand that we want everybody to be a winner, we want everybody to understand the impact of our actions and responsibilities that we need to take. And we think about the impact of our actions, particularly if they will do things which are unnecessarily divisive, then if we can avoid doing such things, then we hope we can do what is good and upright in the eyes of God, and the promises of God, as the Ramban says, for good life in the land will become true and will be given to us. as a result, we can assume, of the way that we have acted. So thank you again for joining in today's shiur. I hope you found it useful. I hope it gives you something to discuss over Shabbat or at another time. And it's given some perspectives which I hope are helpful, not just in understanding our parasha, but on the situations generally which we face. Thank you so much. Please do tune into the US.tv again. And I wish you well and Shabbat Shalom.